please welcome Dr. Oliver Hartwich. Good morning. Thank you for seeing us today, Oliver.
Always a pleasure.
And I am very much looking forward to the sequel in this Da Vinci lecture series. We're looking forward to hearing you speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Graham. And a great pleasure to be with you again today. I've been speaking at portfolio construction events for more than a decade. Always enjoy these events. I thought I should actually start by explaining a bit of my background today. I'm a policy wonk, you may say. For the past 21 years, I've been working in think tanks in London, here in Sydney, and now in Wellington. My academic background is in economics and academic law as well. So I like to think about policies. I like to think about policy change. And what I've experienced over the past 20-something years is actually that has become increasingly hard. Because when I think back to my beginnings in think tank land, I think you could still expect to have a reasonable discussion about policy changes because there was an appetite for reasonable discussions. What I've seen actually over that last 20-something years is actually that it's become increasingly hard to have reasonable, rational discussions on anything. We have become more tribal. We have actually lost the ability to have good debates. And that brings me to my Da Vinci lecture that I gave to you about half a year ago. Back then, I tried to paint a civilisational picture, a cultural picture for you. I tried to explain actually how we built the world in which we live and the institutions that we took for granted, and how much all of these institutions are now under threat. So what I said to you in August was that we have seen now an erosion of trust in our institutions, that we have seen some kind of decay in our institutional core, that we've become complacent, that we think, well, all of this we can take for granted, we don't really have to fight for that anymore. We have gradually withdrawn from reason. And in a way, that has gone hand in hand with a hollowing out of Western self-confidence. Now, half a year later, all of that warning now looks a little bit timid. Because the events we have seen in the past half a year, and especially in the past month, actually have been quite substantial. What we see now is not that the rules are effectively repealed, there is no formal repudiation of the rules, it's just that they are ignored, that they are emptied. We have gone from something that was previously rules-based to something that I would probably now characterize as institutional theater, and I'll explain a little bit later what I mean. And we see a lot of performance in politics, but relatively limited substance. So if you look at the last month, I mean, the beginning of this year, we had 3 crazy weeks in world politics. We had the capture of a sitting head of state in Venezuela. We had the transfer of a Nobel Peace Prize medal to the US president. We then had tariffs threatened on American allies because they didn't support America's claim to Greenland. And then, of course, we had the famous text exchange between the US president and the Norwegian prime minister, where the US president complained, well, if only you had given me the Peace Prize, of course, I wouldn't have to take Greenland, or something like that. We can never quite follow Donald Trump's logic. This is quite extraordinary, because under the old rules-based order, none of this would have really happened. And so this leads me to what I would call the guarantor paradox. The guarantor, of course, refers to the guarantor of this old order. And the assumption of the old world order was always that powerful nations voluntarily constrain themselves. They play by the rules, even if they don't have to. Even if they've got all the military might in the world, they would still be willing to subscribe to the rules-based order. And not just smaller powerful nations, but the most powerful nation on the planet, the United States itself. What we really now see is that the guarantor has become the violator of that order. And so that has implications for your investment models, because we have previously assumed that the rules still somehow hold, but when the guarantor of the old rules-based order becomes the violator of that system, you have to start thinking again. Now, let me explain what I meant by institutional theater. The institutional theater refers to the fact that the facades are still alive. The facades of the old institutions, they are still out there. They are still with us. You can see them. but they are no longer filled with life. They are crumbling. And so, as an example, look at the World Trade Organization. That's been an organization that's effectively been in limbo now for many years. There are now 30 trade disputes that are actually fought out and negotiated into the void because there is no one there who could adjudicate on these trade disputes anymore. That's because the US is blocking the appointment of judges to these trade bodies. The WTO, still nominally live, still exists, but it's institutional theater. We're not getting anywhere with these disputes. The same you could say about the UN Security Council, and that's been a story actually that's been like this for decades now. It is an organization supposedly monitoring the rules-based order, supposedly organizing peace, but all too often, of course, in a state where it's blockaded by its own constitution and can't actually make effective decisions. And then NATO, well, NATO is still alive, it still exists, except as a big question mark hanging over its future. And NATO, of course, did not intervene forcefully when the US president started thinking aloud about taking another NATO member's territory. So, as I said, these institutions, they are still with us, but we are not quite sure what they mean. Again, your risk models, your whole portfolio theory depends on there being some kind of rules, but they have not accounted for the guarantor becoming the threat. And that brings me back to my earlier lecture, the Leonardo da Vinci lecture I gave to you in August last year. We have to think about all of this in a very holistic way. We can't actually just look at just the rules, we can't just look at markets, we have to look at everything together. Because as Leonardo said, and we've seen it in his quote before, specialization is blindness. If you only know one thing, you don't know anything. And so an engineer who only knows engineering but doesn't know anatomy builds worse bridges. And that's basically Leonardo himself. I recommend going back to that earlier Leonardo da Vinci lecture where I tried to explain how everything interconnects. Now, we in this room, you really working in the markets, you need this synthetic vision. You need to look at everything because otherwise you're missing the wood for the trees. So let's look at something that you might not have expected from a lecture at a financial markets symposium. Let's talk about the great dumbing down. It's what I alluded to earlier when I said you can't have reasonable policy discussions anymore these days. And the reason for that, or one of the big reasons, is that we have two types of brain. So there is the deep reading brain. The deep reading brain is a brain that is really trained on large amounts of reading, of long books, of difficult text that you have to get through, hundreds of pages. Because what it does is actually when you read these big books, it does something to your brain. Your neurons connect differently. You're able to think in an analytical way. You are thinking in a linear way where you can actually connect the dots along a line. And you also develop empathy, especially if you read fiction. You can actually feel your way into different people. So your brain that's trained on a lot of reading, on a lot of deep thinking, becomes a deep reading brain that is able to deal with complexity. What we have seen, of course, over the last 10, 15 years is the development of something completely different. And that is what I would call the scrolling brain. The scrolling brain is fundamentally neurologically different from the reading brain. It is a brain that's trained on scrolling. You take out your phone and you read stories, you read tweets, you read Instagram stories, or you go to TikTok, or you watch 9-second YouTube videos like my son does. I find this a bit bizarre, but this is a scan and react brain. You just need the next kind of dopamine hit. That means your thinking remains on the surface. You're never really going deeply into any kind of topic, any kind of issue. And that, of course, also means often your responses are tribal because you wouldn't have had the chance to even reflect on things. You just jump to conclusions. Now, in theory, it would be nice if we, in our modern world, had biliterate brains, meaning we still have the ability to read, to understand deeply, to think analytically. This is what we have historically developed. And add to that what we need in our modern times. And our modern times, of course, require us to have this kind of scrolling ability as well. But having these biliterate brains is quite rare. Most people are not like that. I mean, you, of course, might be like that because you grew up in a time where you had to read long books and where you had to focus, and you learned the other stuff, the scrolling, later on in your lives. But for people actually growing up today, chances are they're growing up with a scrolling brain only, and they will never develop the kind of deep reading brain that we once took for granted. And this has implications, not just for how we do calculations, not just for how we perform at school or university. This has implications for us actually in our markets, in our politics, how we perform in society. You can already see this in the PISA study. You know, the OECD checks the performance of students in the member states every few years, and we can now see that we have lost an enormous amount of mathematics competence and reading competence over the past few years across practically all OECD countries. What does that mean for markets? What does that mean for politics? Well, I would argue this cognitive decline leads us to a more tribal form of politics. And it works like this. We have this cognitive atrophy where our brains are no longer able to think deeply. What does it mean? We lose our deep reading circuits, and that removes our capacity for nuance. We can't see shades of gray anymore. We see just black or white, and our brain is not able to process things anymore because we're used to kind of scrolling. That leads us straight into tribalism. That means the electorate is no longer able to say, they've got a point, they might also have a point, let's find a kind of compromise or synthesize. No, it's us versus them. It becomes extremely tribal. It's left versus right. It is old versus young. It is whatever versus whatever, because we can only think in these binary categories. That leads us straight into post-rational policy, because you only have to appeal to some really primal instincts because you can't think properly anymore. And of course, our political leaders know this. So they will prioritize this tribal signaling over analytical rigor. You will not get deep, complex, interesting policy proposals anymore. You will just get something that sounds right if you think about it for about 9 seconds. And what you then get is you get strange policy. As a case study, we could take the UK mini budget under Liz Truss. So let's look into this a bit more deeply. You perhaps remember Liz Truss. That was the UK Prime Minister that lasted slightly shorter than an average lettuce. That's the same UK former Prime Minister who recently tweeted that Donald Trump is right on everything. That was Liz Truss. So Liz Truss actually started a mini budget for the little time that she had in office, and that mini budget was economically illiterate and ill-informed. It was against every kind of professional advice to the degree she even sought professional advice, and it led to a protest in the bond markets. So the bond markets basically dealt with Liz Truss, and she was soon history and replaced herself. Now, you might say, well, this was a deplorable episode in British politics, of which there are many, of course, these days. But what it did was actually it demonstrated to markets that UK politics is no longer as rational as they previously had hoped. And therefore, there was a lasting effect on UK gilts. So now you basically price this in, that UK politics has permanently become less rational. And so you're effectively paying an irrationality premium. And so that's an extra yield demanded for political risk, for systemic political risk. And it's not just the UK. We can see similar things, of course, happening with the US. I mean, there is performative brinkmanship with the debt ceiling. We see this all the time in France. We had a major crisis there in 2024, but actually you might say it's still ongoing. We have constant problems, of course, with is the Fed still rational? Is the Fed still predictable? Or is there now political influence? This is a major problem for our politics. So there is this dumbing down of our political dialogue. The next problem here is our architecture of markets has changed because of the undermining of the rules-based order. We previously thought the world was flat, and we had this 1990s theory of kind of globalization as a big mesh where everybody can trade with everybody. We now know this is not true. We now have networks where it really matters who controls that network. And so what is happening is actually that all of our trading relationships become power relationships. We are using this now for weaponized interdependence, meaning whoever controls that panopticon has control over everybody playing in that game. And therefore, it also leads to the ruler of that game actually taking the information advantages that they have to control everything, but also to block people they might not want, and he who controls the hub now controls the flow. We see this most clearly actually in the world financial order, where we're moving away from the dollar, or where the BRICS are trying to establish some rival organizations to bypass the SWIFT system. We see further vulnerability without a global rules-based order when we just look at individual choke points on which our global order still hinges. We have seen this actually with the Panama Canal, with climate-exposed daily transits, that they were down over time. We have seen it, or we are seeing it in the Strait of Hormuz, which was mentioned earlier, because it is one of those choke points for international oil transport. We see it in the Strait of Malacca, of course. We see it in technology as well. I mean, there's only one company that really produces the machines that build the chips on which we all rely, and that's ASML in the Netherlands. And we see, of course, 90% of that chip production run on these Dutch machines happening in Taiwan. So what we see is actually a world that is moving away from rules-based, that is dumbing down, that is becoming not the kind of flat network that we used to have, but something where individual networks are becoming more power plays. And we see choke points that are actually stopping us at every step of the way. And what it means then is that the old hierarchy of risk has flipped. Previously, geography didn't really matter that much. You thought first about your asset class, and then you thought afterwards, well, where is it? Now, in our post-rational world, it becomes a lot more important to figure out where in this world you hold your investments. So in the post-rational world, actually geography matters a lot more, because you want to be somewhere where it's safe to invest, where the old rules still at least partially apply, and where you can still have at least partially a reasonable policy debate. And that's why I think we have to move beyond the Bloomberg terminal. Previously, if you're working in markets, you were looking at things like GDP growth, you look at deficit numbers, you look at inflation figures. All important still, but we now need to think about some other indicators. We need to think about civilisational indicators. We need to look at the PISA scores, because PISA scores actually inform how a country will be able to function in the future. Is the population still educated enough to have a reasonable policy debate? We need to think about the rule of law. Is the rule of law still in place? You can measure this. I mean, there's a rule of law index, trust metrics. Think of metrics like the Edelman Trust Barometer, where you can see actually how much trust we still have in societies. So, in summary, if you see a decline in a country's PISA scores today, that might translate into a sovereign risk in about 10 years' time, because their politics are becoming irrational. The next conclusion from that is, of course, that you have to then think about, well, where do you even want to be invested? Do you want to be invested in something that is essentially a promise, like government debt? Or do you want to rather tilt your investments to something that's a bit more tangible? So infrastructure investment, minerals, anything that you can actually touch. Because the thing is, all of these promises are subject to the irrationality that I mentioned earlier, whereas the investment in real stuff is actually a value that's derived from physical scarcity. Think about it this way: a dairy farm in Denmark produces milk regardless of the prime minister's politics. It doesn't matter, because that milk is milk. What it also means is, in this world that is less certain, less rules-based, we have to think about resilience in a different way. Previously, of course, we had just-in-time production, and we could bank on secure shipping routes, and therefore it was perfectly safe to have a very lean model. You have to sacrifice a lot of this efficiency these days, because you can't bank on that anymore. You want to insure yourself against one of your suppliers being permanently out of reach in the future. That means we are effectively trading efficiency for insurance. And that means you probably have to also take into account that economic growth will be weaker for decades to come, because we are sacrificing this efficiency for that reason. And individual companies are, of course, already doing that. Now, what it means then is we have to think about, so where are the safe destinations? Where are the islands in which you can still invest these days? In my essay, I've called them the Enlightenment Islands. And these are places where you can still find a competent bureaucracy, which has become something rather rare these days, where we find transparency and integrity, and where we find societal trust. all really important, all prerequisites of actually having rational decisions, rational business decisions, and rational political decisions. So basically, these Enlightenment Islands are places where the old foundations still hold. I think of, for example, the Scandinavian countries. There's probably something about cool water that works for them. They have very strong rule of law metrics. They have incredible civil engagement, where 40% of adults, for example, in Denmark volunteer regularly, where there is deep social trust, which you can measure and which has been accumulated over centuries. And all of this trust translates into economic value. That's why they're performing rather well. Into the first tier, I would, oops, what has happened here? Could you bring back my slides? Into that first tier, let me just continue here. They're back. I would count the engineered sanctuaries, I would call them. Thanks for bringing them back. I can see them again here. I've got them there. Thank you. Singapore, of course, world leading in PISA, great education system, and a technocracy, basically, which runs the country efficiently. You could also count Estonia, because Estonia is one of those transformation countries that really massively improved their performance since the 1990s through digitalization. Of course, they've got a complicated neighbor, but that's a different story. We can also count Switzerland, of course, because over centuries they built up a position as one of the world's strongest safe havens. They've got a functioning, if a little bit, strange democracy. They've got constitutional property rights, and they're decentralized. So it is really hard to get anything done in Switzerland because of this decentralized nature of the Swiss political system. But then again, it is also very difficult to destroy what the Swiss have because everything takes forever until they find national consensus, which is a positive in these days. And therefore, brings us back to the physical assets. If you hold a gold bar somewhere in Zurich, that's probably worth more than a gold bar you hold anywhere else because it is safe. It is physically safe. Then we've got some secondary Enlightenment Islands, secondary tier Enlightenment Islands. We could count Japan, but there the problem is, of course, demography. We could talk about South Korea, where the problem is also not just demography, but also recent political turbulence, but it is still a relatively safe destination. And Canada, which I think is also quite a safe country, but again, with a troublesome neighbor, making their lives really hard. And now you wonder, where do we have Australia and New Zealand? Well, I think we are in that second tier as well. We live on a great inheritance in both countries because we had bold reforms in both countries under Hawke and Keating here and under Roger Douglas and David Lange in New Zealand. We are still relatively prosperous countries and we come from a good background and from a good economic tradition. But we can see in both countries that our foundations are eroding. We haven't really had any great productivity increases for a long time because the great reforms we undertook are now 30, 40 years in the past. We have also seen a massive cognitive decline in both countries. You just have to look at our PISA scores over the last few years, although at least in New Zealand we've got a very good education minister working on that. But also in both countries we have seen civic amnesia, where very few people still actually understand how our political system works these days. And the problem is, you cannot defend an inheritance, even if it's a very good inheritance, if you don't understand how it works. So in summary, what we need to do is actually we need to come to a more virtuous cycle when it comes to our policy debates, from civic engagement to effective governance, to enforceable contracts, and to genuine trust. This is how the world used to work. This is actually how your modern portfolio theory still would like the world to work. But in order to get there, of course, we have to work on our foundations. And therefore, what you need to do as investment managers, as portfolio managers, you have to find a new due diligence framework. You should ask yourself with every decision you make, is the judiciary in that country independent? Are the people tribal in their politics? Is there any chance that supply chains might get disrupted? And can the government break its own laws, or is this constrained in some form by the rule of law? And if you do this well, you will come to a new due diligence dashboard. You will look at all of these factors I mentioned before. You will look at how the country is doing in education, on PISA. You will look at the rule of law index. You will look at where the country's values stand. And then, of course, you can still compare with all of the other metrics that you're used to. You can look at GDP growth, you can look at debt and equity ratios, you can look at inflation. I mean, that's all still relevant, but it's not the only thing that matters anymore these days. And therefore, we all have to become builders in the dark. These are strange times. We are seeing the end of an old world order. The new world order hasn't quite started just yet. And therefore, we are in the meantime. And that's the title of the essay that I wrote for you. And in the meantime means that the weather is still relatively fair. I mean, we're not quite there in the storm yet, I would say. I mean, these times are unpleasant, but we still have a chance now to make provisions for the strange kind of world, a world without firm rules that we are about to enter. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Leonardo's legacy, and in the meantime, 2 14,000-word essays. Shortly, there'll be a second of 2 videos that deal with the topic that Oliver has just delivered, the sequel to Leonardo's legacy, why investment professionals must become civilisational stewards. It's online, on.edu, and investing in a more tribal, less rational world, the interregnum, as it's called. In between, an old world that has died is being put to you. It's got some entrails, it's wriggling, but it's gone. And now we're looking forward. What do we do in the meantime? So a big thank you to Dr. Hartwich. There's a poll on Frankie. Apologies for the Frankie blip with George, but I'm sure you now know that it's his birthday. And in a few minutes, we'll open the poll for this next session. And so you should have had the opportunity to get your head around how Frankie works. Meanwhile, Wayne Fitzgibbon. Wayne, thanks for coming along. Take 30 seconds thinking differently about the markets. What does that mean to you? What does that mean to how you think, how you write? And why is it that working through with Oliver is in your space?
Well, I think one of the key points that Oliver keeps making is that the entire industry during my career, long career,
very long,
has been based on the Markowitz thinking, you know, optimal portfolios, diversification, measuring manager performance or asset class performance based on indices and various things like that. And if you think back, if you actually look at the perspective, go back and go, well, that's a 75-year-old theory, 75 years old, 1950s. The world was very different in the 1950s. But even worse than that, if you like the mathematics, as I do, it's actually built on 19th century mathematics. The world has moved on. And I think the challenge, of course, is that everyone here, you know, has rules to live by. There are regulations, there are client expectations, there's the general approach that the investment industry global takes to building portfolios. All of those things are, if you like, part of the infrastructure. And as some of your slides are brilliant. The infrastructure, it's like that big building that you showed on top. The infrastructure underpinning that is eroding at a rapid pace.
Okay.
And that's why I think this is so important.
All right, so thank you. And there's nothing wrong with the 1950s, I don't think, in total, but I get your point. So with
I
that...
think we were both born in them.
With that in mind, Wayne, take a few minutes now to probe the proposition that Oliver is putting and see what the chinks are, if you like, in his argument.
Well, I think I agree with most of what Oliver says. I'm probably a bit less optimistic in the sense that if you look through the sweep of history and if you read your first lecture, You talk about the Treaty of Westphalia, which of course followed, at the time, probably the bloodiest war in history within Europe. But then again, that took the bloodiest war in history before the nations of Europe came together and we've got to stop fighting over whether we're Protestant or Catholic. And if you think about all of the major changes, it often takes a crisis. 2 world wars, a Great Depression, gave birth to the current regime that has now ended. And I'm wondering if there needs to be another crisis before we move to a better regime. And I don't know, what do you think?
I wonder the same, actually. There is a habit, actually, of pathological learning. So you make every possible mistake, and then you make it lead to a big disaster and a big crisis, and then you clean up and you learn the lessons, and then typically we forget them again after 2 or 3 generations and start again. There is something like that in cycles. I'm not sure whether I'm necessarily more optimistic than you, because my nagging fear is actually that when it comes to that big crisis that you probably see coming and I fear, do we still have the capacity to rebuild afterwards? I mean, after previous crises, of course, you could see, okay, that was all a bit of a disaster, and now we have to start again, but we still had the brains actually enabling us to do that and to start again. We still started from relatively well-developed intellectual foundations. As we have, as I said, just basically run down our intellectual foundations, as we have uninstalled our reading brains, are we even still able to rebuild after that crisis? That is my fear, and I've got no great answer for that. But yeah, it would be nice to avoid the crisis and to actually start the reforms earlier, but the world doesn't look like that right now.
I'm sure Elon Musk will have solved that problem, and will all not be working, and robots will do everything. But on a more practical note, one of the things that struck me about, where you invest is much more important than what you invest in. Again, that is the antithesis of modern portfolio theory. But I do wonder how we move away from this fascination with indices. Things, simple things like the your future, your super, your future, or your future, your super performance test that they put the wrong way around. That is fundamental to that sort of thinking, that there's some benchmark that you've got to beat. But if that benchmark, as all benchmarks and all market cap portfolios are, it's a reflection of past success, not future success. It's going to be very difficult for the industry to move away from that for a whole bunch of reasons. How do we do it?
Yeah, it is difficult to move away from that. It's also difficult to move away from it for a different reason. I mean, if all the world's leading funds and their fund managers decided to follow my advice, they would all go into Singapore tomorrow, and basically all of Singapore would be bought by lunchtime. Because there is a limit actually to how much all of these Enlightenment Islands can absorb in capital, because you can't actually shift everything out of risky places, because we have unfortunately too many of these risky places. But what I'm saying is actually that you should still try to have at least a core of your investment in jurisdictions that are more predictable, more stable. And for the others, you have to be aware that it's more than just a normal kind of risk premium. This is an irrationality premium. So you have to probably demand more from investments in riskier jurisdictions.
So what you're really saying, if I can paraphrase, is that it's a reweighting, not just of portfolios, but of the way you think about.
Yep.
So if you are investing in the United States, you might buy defense companies.
Well, previously you would have had some risk assessment, and now you need an additional irrationality assessment on top of it.
Yes.
It's a bit like what happened with Liz Truss and the mini budget. It had lasting impacts on how much the UK Treasury has to pay on their debt.
Yes, so that's been a rather permanent state. But I think I think one of the other interesting things that you talk about is hub and spoke, and I always try to focus on the pinch points in markets, the actual where the flows go and what determines the flows, and how how they're implemented and how people buy and sell, the mechanics of markets. And there is a lot of choke points. And the biggest choke point is always in credit markets. And we're seeing a lot of turmoil in credit markets, or at least private credit markets at the moment globally. Those choke points are still fundamentally the US dollar choke points. But as you say, with the tokenization, you mentioned in the, I don't think you mentioned it in the lecture, but in the paper, you mentioned the tokenization of those BRIC currencies. Yep. Now, for anyone that's not necessarily familiar, I hope everyone's familiar with tokenization, there is no doubt that it will be the future of every asset. You know, it might be 20 years, 10 years, I don't know, but everything will become tokenized. And yet at the moment, one of the interesting things about the US is that the whole, you know, the whole theatre around the cryptocurrency markets and the setting up of these stable coins and the legislation that's still stuck in Congress is all about not allowing the US Federal Reserve to issue a digital currency. So when people start talking about the dollar, like they're almost, you know, committing suicide in a sense as a reserve currency if they do that.
Well, the only thing is, of course, what's saving the dollar is that there is no rival currency ready to take over. That's why the dollar is still maintaining a relatively strong position, not the strong position it used to have, but still a dominant position over other currencies because no other currency is ready. But it's more than just the financial choke points, of course. It's actually physical, good old physical choke points. I mean, look at the Strait of Hormuz, 20% of the world's oil. I actually just this week interviewed a just recently retired Major General for a podcast who spent a lot of his time in US intelligence. And we were discussing the implications for a country like New Zealand. I think for Australia would be similar. In New Zealand, we have current fuel reserves that would last us 14 days if we get a disruption in fuel supply. So after 14 days, it would become a bit of a problem for us. And it would probably, if it comes to the full escalation of the war around Iran, it would probably lead to a scenario that we wouldn't have seen since the 1970s oil crisis. Because we have actually built a world that is dependent on these 21 kilometers in the Strait of Hormuz and the months it would take to clear it up if it ever becomes mined. So these are the choke points that we have to keep in mind. And again, they require a different kind of risk assessment and a risk premium.